2013 is a very, very special year for me. Although I started volunteering with ABR in 2009, I had been a volunteer. It was in March of 2013 that I was asked, or actually earlier in 2013, that I was asked to be the weekend curator. So starting in 2013, the first bears that came in were the very first ABR bears that I took care of here. So very special year for me, and I've got more stories than we have time to share about this year. But I know that Dana Dodd had called me and asked me if I would be consider being the weekend curator, and of course I said yes to that. And I'm telling you, the ink on the contract wasn't even dry before I get the call from her at work one day, and she said, "Are you ready to take care of bear cubs?" And I said, "Well, I'll be ready whenever they come. I'm ready." And she said, "Well, they're coming tonight." And I mean, it was just within the week after being asked, we got our first cubs in, and that was. Also, the weekend that I think we had an event that some of our volunteers were doing at Benny and Jerry's in Gatlinburg. So you can see the theme here of where we got the names. But there was a firefighter in South Carolina, and he was driving along the road, and he saw a cardboard box on the side of the road and something moving in it, and got out. And at first, he thought it was three Labrador puppies in the cardboard box. So he gets them and he takes them and realizes these aren't puppies at all. They're three very tiny bear cubs, and their eyes were just opened. So they were about 5 weeks of age, and they weighed about 2 pounds each. And of course, he calls the South Carolina DNR, and then they contacted ABR and started arranging to have those cubs brought here to our facility. The two brothers initially came. They were stable enough to be transported and come, and so they came on March the 2nd, and then it was about 3 weeks later that their sister joined them. And these guys were, I know the first night, I may have told you this story before. I was so worried about, I mean, ABR just hired me as the weekend curator, and here I'm taking care of these two little 2 pound bear cubs, and I was so scared that they were going to die on my watch that I literally slept in the floor next to the crate just so I could hear them breathing, because I was scared to death that something was going to happen that night. But they survived in spite of any care that they had by me, and these were also Coy's first cubs as well. And we had Rick Noseworthy still around helping us as we needed at that time. And they were just quite a handful. I nicknamed them Dumb and Dumber, the boys, Benny and Jerry. They were something else. You thought the triplets were something. The triplets remind me of these three. And then when the sister came, she absolutely was in charge of both of the boys. And she was very smart and very intelligent, and usually could fool them. But the whole threesome were really known for just being mischievous, always into something, constantly wrestling, playing games, and then the infamous formula wars. Whenever we would put a bowl of formula, they started lapping from a bowl by then. They all three had to go to the same bowl. There would be three bowls, and sometimes we even put out a fourth, and they all three had to have the same one. And it was usually 187, Benny, who was on the bottom of the pile, and then the other two were piled up on him. And in the end, they would all three be soaked with formula from head to claw. And you know, they ended up just licking it off themselves to get it, even though there were multiple bowls. So we would just shake our heads. But they were just something else. I have a lot of memories of these three. And they did go back to South Carolina, were released there, and upon their release, 187 weighed 105 pounds, 188 weighed 114, and 189 weighed 90 pounds. So they did end up going back home to South Carolina, but a lot of memories of these three. And the picture that you see is on top of the acclimation pen. And we've now covered that so that bears cannot get on top of it, because at that time they could, and of course they could see us approaching. So after 2013, we made it to where those bears could not get on top of those acclimation pens. They liked laying up there and playing, but it was a problem because they could see us. So, but a lot of memories with these guys, and they were something else. But three beautiful bears that returned to South Carolina. The next bear that came in was Bear 190, Boston. He came in the week following the Boston Marathon bombing that had occurred. And so I guess that's kind of where, that's one of the places that Ben, our Facebook administrator, got the name. But then also, the writer of the song "Please Come to Boston" was from Mountain Home, Tennessee, which is where this bear came from. And I think that was Kenny Loggins. That name has escaped me. Maybe one of you guys can grab that for me real quick. I should have looked that up. But he's from Mountain Home, Tennessee, which is where this bear was from. But this little bear showed up in someone's yard and was trying to get water from a water spigot that was outside of the residence, so that was kind of leaky, and was just very small. So this was the end of April, and he only weighed 3.5 pounds and just looked pitiful. There was no mother around, so the resident, of course, called TWRA, and they brought him here to us. And he was so weak, but he would not allow us to hold him, to give him a bottle. He was very independent and just had a strong survival instinct, and we fed him by syringe with his formula, but he did not want us to give him, he didn't want us holding him. He would hold himself, brace himself up on his crate to take his syringe. Just a very strong spirit. He was also known for being very friendly and empathetic toward other bears, and was a fan favorite at that time and a curator favorite. I still say, out of all the bears, this one was my favorite. He still wins the prize. There's a lot that come in that are some competition, but this little guy still wins the prize. But he one of the things that he did, the next bear that we're going to talk about, that Bear 191, he was very empathetic toward her. And then there was Bear 193 that came in, and I'll tell you those stories as we come up to those bears. But he just was very, very friendly to other bears, but he could be mischievous too. He was notorious for sneaking up behind the 187, 188, Benny and Jerry, and either biting one of them on the bottom or smacking them and then running, and they would think each other had done it. And then the two brothers would get in a fight with one another. So he could be sneaky too, but he was a beautiful bear, very friendly bear, not to curators. He was very much a wild bear, but he was returned back to his natural home in October, weighing 64 pounds. And I think Dana texted me and said it was Dave Loggins, not Kenny Loggins, Dave Loggins, that wrote "Please Come to Boston." And so two sources of where he got the name, but it kind of fit him in the end. But I've told you before, this is probably my all-time favorite bear, and still is. He's still the reigning king of all the bears that I've cared for. The next bear that came in, Bear 191, this was in May. And at this time, Bear 190, Boston, was still in the cub nursery. And this little bear was found alongside of the road on Foothills Parkway. And she was very weak, dehydrated, and just seemed to be in pain. And she had a large head. And then upon examination by our vets at UT, she was diagnosed with hydrocephalus, which of course is a condition that a bear cannot live with. And so she had to be humanely euthanized the next day. But while she was in the nursery, she would cry in pain, and she was crying. And we would hear, it was actually Coy, because this happened during the week when I wasn't here. I never actually saw Bear 191, but I remember Coy telling that he heard Boston over in his cage making gentle sounds, ooh, 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 to this bear in response to her crying. So, you know, I told you that that bear was very empathetic, so he was to her. And this particular bear was actually given her name in honor of one of ABR's most dedicated and formidable volunteers and board members, Betty Jones. And I knew Betty early on from when I was a volunteer, and she had passed away not long before this 2013, and so this bear was named in honor of her. But if you've been following the history, you know we've had a few bears along the way that had this condition, hydrocephalus, and it's just kind of one of those things that occur. And usually, what happens is these bears, it usually occurs about between 4 to 6 months of age is when it shows up, and they'll usually be orphaned because they can't keep up with the family, and maybe mother still has other cubs, and it's a tough situation, but she has to make the decision to keep moving to feed the other cubs. So these little bears usually will pop up by themselves, and it's always apparent there's something wrong. In the past, they've been blind and had neurological issues, but it always results in euthanization. The next two bears that came, this was from a mother with 5 cubs, and we've said that that is very rare. And she was hanging around the Gatlinburg Resort area, getting into human garbage and food. So bears that feast on garbage and human food, it isn't uncommon for them to sometimes have, especially 4 cubs and even 5, because those tend to be very fat, very big bears. I restrain from using the word healthy because they're not healthy if they're eating human food. They may be fat, but that is not healthy. But she was getting into some trouble there in that area, and so they trapped her. They were going to relocate them, and they were able to capture her and 3 of her cubs. And so they held them overnight, trying to catch the other 2. And ultimately they couldn't. They kept trying, so they couldn't hold the family any longer. So they had to go ahead and relocate mom and her 3 cubs. And then they finally, a few days later, were able to capture these 2, number 192 and 193, and brought them to ABR, and where they joined the rest of them. And the little bears were traumatized and frightened, and the brother would not allow the little female to eat. And so after a few days, we realized she's getting weaker and apparently losing weight because she's not getting any food. And I think it was just a fear of not understanding there's going to be plenty of food. And he was fearful of that. So we separated the 2, and we ended up putting her in with Bear 190, Boston. And he was, once again, he was very gentle with her. And I was feeding one time. They were in one of the perimeter pens down in the enclosures 1 and 2, which were all we had at that time. And I had put the bowl of grapes and on one side, and then of course had closed the divider and was cleaning the other, and then had opened all that up. And as I was packing my stuff up, getting ready to go, I looked and I saw Bear 190 get a cluster of grapes and take it over to the little female 193, and because she would not approach the bowl while he was eating. And so he took the grapes over to her to share them with her. So that's what I mean when I talk about how empathetic he was, and he had that side to being empathetic and friendly to other bears. So he and this little female were together for a period of time, and then 190, 192, and 193 all ended up in an acclimation pen together, and we're all big pals until they eventually joined the South Carolina trio, and so there were 6 of them all together. But the things I remember about these two, particularly the little female, she had the prettiest face, and that's her on the left in the picture. And she was just, she was very short. She was a very small bear, just short and round, and just had a beautiful little face. But she loved pears. And even though she was kind of timid and gentle, and maybe would not, she ended up being pretty brave about getting food, and nobody kept her from food anymore. But when we would throw those pears in there, she let everybody know in there, those are my pears and I want them. And she had no qualms at all standing up for her pears. But that little bear, every time I think of her, I think about how much she enjoyed pears. So I've always hoped that somewhere out in the wild she gets a pear occasionally because she enjoyed them so much. But they were released, and at release they weighed 73 pounds, the male, and 56.5 pounds, the little female. The next two bears that came in August, and they were two sisters that were orphaned when their mother had to be euthanized. She was in very, very poor health, and as I recall, I think all of her teeth were out and just something wrong, and she couldn't take care of herself, much less her cubs. So the cubs were brought here, and they weighed about 11 pounds. And I remember these two sisters as being very frightened, and they were very protective of one another. And one of them would always be hiding behind the other while they were here. But they remained here till December, early December, and then they were released weighing 70.5 pounds and 73 pounds. But they were the scraggliest looking little cubs when they came in. They were pitiful looking. And but you can see that as they got good nutrition, they grew into some beautiful bears. The next little bear is, to me, is probably one of the saddest stories. Although some people think that it's a happy ending, but it's kind of a bittersweet ending. But Bear 196 came from Arkansas, and she was confiscated after being illegally raised by a man in Arkansas, to the point that he had her in diapers. He rode her in his truck through drive-throughs to get ice cream. I mean, literally raising her in his home. And Arkansas, of course, found out, and they confiscated this bear, and she was brought here. And they really had compassion for the little bear and had hoped that maybe she could be rehabilitated, and maybe that could be reversed and turned around. And of course, we did our best with her, but it became apparent very early on that all those months of food conditioning and habituation to humans, it was not reversible. And although she could be defensive and she would huff and blow, she would not leave. So if we were near the enclosures, she would maybe follow us around as we were throwing food. Even though she couldn't see us, we were on the other side of the enclosure. So she could be blustery, but she would refuse to back off and leave. She still saw humans as a source of food. So the wildlife officer in Arkansas just really had a soft spot for this little bear, and because it just was not her fault that her ability to live as a wild bear was taken away from her. And so they talked a lot about what to do about this bear, and there was even talk about maybe collaring her and seeing if she would be okay. But ultimately, when you have a bear that's food conditioned and habituated to humans, that is a great risk to put that bear out in the public. Particularly a bear that would not back away from a human. So ultimately, it was decided that she was going to have to be placed somewhere, and the North American Bear Center in Ely, Minnesota agreed to take her, and she still resides there today and is known as Holly, and I know many of you probably follow her. And she does seem to be a very happy bear, brings a lot of joy to other people, but as I said, it's bittersweet because her ability to live life as a wild bear, which is what she was created for, was taken from her. by this gentleman who raised her. And so when we try to put forward that message of why it's so important that we be responsible around bears and all wildlife and not habituate them and not food condition them, it's because those actions on our part can take their life. Um, Sometimes it results in a bear having to be euthanized or a bear being killed, but then sometimes it results in a bear losing their life and their ability to live wild and free as they're meant to do. Uh, this picture, I always get tickled because she was not a very pretty bear. When she was here, she was a very odd looking bear, and we always called this Poppy's glamour shot because Ken LaValle captured this picture, and it was the best picture that we ever got over here because she really just was an odd looking bear. But if you see her now at the North American Bear Center, she's just gorgeous. She did turn from that ugly duckling into the swan and is a beautiful bear. But so I say that that's why I say this is kind of it's to me, it's still a sad story because her life as a bear, as a wild bear, living wild and free, was taken from her by the actions of a human. And that's why sometimes we preach that message over and over and over. We have to be responsible and make sure that we're not doing anything that would food condition